You're listening to Curiosity Invited with David Bryan here on LA Talk Radio.
Hello, my name is David Bryan, and this is Curiosity Invited, a podcast inspired by endless curiosity. Tune in for an open-minded conversation about interesting and important things. Hello, my name is David Bryan, and welcome to Curiosity Invited podcast, where today I'll be speaking with professor, researcher, academician, teacher, author, Dr. Gregory Chasson. His recent book, Flawed: Why Perfectionism is a Challenge for Management. Dr. Chasson is the director of behavioral interventions of the Obsessive Compulsive and Related Disorders Clinic in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience at the University of Chicago. I'll bet I'm not the first person who said that is a mouthful. So he is widely recognized in this field, and he's written a book that sounds like it's just focused on business, right? Why perfectionism is a challenge for management, but it is clearly rich territory for anyone who suffers from perfectionism, works with people with some sort of perfectionism, manages people with perfectionism, works within groups of all sorts. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. I certainly did. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Curiosity Invited. My name is David Bryan, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with someone I have just met moments ago, Dr. Gregory Chasson, a behavioral scientist, a clinical psychologist, and a professor and writer. And it turns out he's written numerous academic papers, both himself and with others, and has recently published a book called, the full title is Flawed: Why Perfectionism is a Challenge for Management. So let me just ask you, before we dive into what all that means, is there a lot of conversation in the business world about perfectionism, or is this, because I've not seen that, but I wasn't looking. But
Right.
is there a lot of, is this a topic that people have spoken about a lot?
No, actually, they haven't, which is partly why I wrote the book.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you asked that, because part of the reason I wrote the book is to hopefully get some discourse going on perfectionism in the workplace, because I think it's one of those issues that's there, but people don't necessarily realize it. And it is an absolute saboteur of productivity and healthy workplace dynamics. And I think it's one of those aspects that is not well appreciated or understood, but actually explains so much difficulty in the workplace.
Do you think it's because when I thought, geez, I haven't come across that, and clearly it's there. My
Oh, yeah.
background is education. I taught for years, and I started a school, and I taught continuing throughout that, and uh, I don't know if anybody was using it technically correctly, but it was not uncommon to find a kid who was, quote, a perfectionist.
Uh-huh.
And there's that weird territory of, well, when does focus on excellence and trying to dedication to the task, and when does the needle tip into the zone where, we have a problem here? And the one thing that kept coming up, at least in my experience, was, the kids who could never give it in, could never turn it in, because it was never, and sometimes it was phenomenal work that they couldn't release on time, couldn't release without a threat, right? You're going to lose points, you're going to, all those things that people say. And sometimes it was terrible. And sometimes it was an impediment to even beginning a task, because so when Could you sort through this territory for us? When does I want to make sure I get this right become, warning, Will Robinson, we've got a real problem here. There's something else going on.
Right. Well, first of all, you did a nice job of articulating some of the main issues you see with perfectionism. Uh, Procrastination, in large part, a lot of it is because of perfectionism. And that's not the only cause. There are lots of reasons that you might end up procrastinating, but perfectionism is probably a very common reason where you can't quite get it where you think it needs to be. It can't quite, it doesn't feel just right. You don't feel like it's good enough, and therefore keeps getting pushed off and pushed off and pushed off.
And
Or
so you, in some cases, don't even start.
yeah, so I call that in the book in chapter 6, we talk about process paralysis, which is where you try to perfect the approach or the strategy or the process. And it could include things like trying to know the optimal strategy and trying to figure it out, or trying to identify the optimal steps of doing something. And you get so flustered and get so paralyzed trying to do that that you don't even get started in the first place.
Mm,
Um, or you're so anxious about not getting it just right that you just don't even start. It's easier just to dig your head in the sand. And so I do think that a lot of procrastination stems from perfectionism. And so, you say, does this happen in the workplace? And I think the first question you got to ask yourself is, well, do you see procrastination in the workplace? And, if the answer is, I would, how could it not be? Yes. I mean, it's
yeah,
everywhere. But you're absolutely right. I mean, you see this in kids, and this is, I think it goes to show you how soon and early it develops
yeah.
in one's life. And kids, you asked me what separates perfectionism from non-perfectionism, and it's less about where the needle is, like you indicated. And I think there's actually a bit of a qualitative difference in that people with perfectionism are extremely rigid and excessive in their expectations and rigid in general around their thinking. So they might
Mm.
have excessive expectations about things needing to be a certain way. And then they're also just rigid in general and all or none about the way they think about things. And so the rigid expectations then interact with these excessive expectations to create, a um, a pretty paralyzing experience for people with perfectionism because they have these unattainable goals and then they can't pivot and shift gears because of
Mm.
their rigid thinking when those goals become futile to achieve. And so it's really the cognitive rigidity and the inflexibility and the excessive expectations that make perfectionism.
Say
Now,
that
what
again, because no, I want to. Everybody should hear that again, including me.
Yeah, so it's the cognitive rigidity, the inability to pivot and to change one's mindset. In fact, we call it set shifting difficulties, mindset shifting,
Sure.
shifting one's perspective. Very narrow and sort of like the Titanic that can't be shifted out of
Right.
the
Takes a really
iceberg,
long
right?
time to turn that
Right.
freighter.
And then there's the excessive expectations, right? The
Right.
idea that the goals are just well beyond what would be normative or other people expect. Like I have to get 100% on everything, right? Would
Excessive
be in excess.
expectations of themselves, of their performance.
Yeah, well, we can talk about that because there's actually multiple types of perfectionism. One
Ah,
is self-oriented, which is about oneself. You hold these expectations of yourself. And then there's other-oriented perfectionism, which is where you project those standards and expectations in a rigid way onto other people. And then there's what's called socially prescribed perfectionism, which is where you have these perfectionistic tendencies, but they are perceived to come from outside of you and from society at large. So you see an image of a beautiful model on a magazine and you think that's how you're supposed to look. That is
mhm.
a socially prescribed perfectionism.
Right. Eh, that's the environment that may or may not affect the particular individual, right? Somebody looks at it and goes, well, that's not me, or that's not real. Somebody else looks at it and, they'll never go to the beach again.
Right.
Right.
But the
Right.
bottom line is that it's there, it's socially prescribed as meaning beautiful and optimal.
Right.
And the degree to which someone internalizes that is socially prescribed perfectionism
I see.
because
I see. I
it
see.
really can impact someone's view of themselves. Whereas the person next to you, they may not care, the person, you might sort of internalize that as, oh, that's how I'm supposed to look.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I was wondering also because it's not a big topic at the moment, um, if anything surfaced, like, do you think that this is uh, a growing issue in the workplace because more and more work, I don't know if that's true. Certainly more and more work of a certain kind happens in teams, sort of stridently in teams, people work in teams from no matter where they are. And so it shows up because I could imagine, well, you're the expert. You should tell us. I mean, you could hear me imagine, but I can imagine that sometimes it's the perfectionist is an impediment to things moving on because
Mhm.
because they can't produce in the timely way. And sometimes I could imagine it shows up because the person is completely intolerant of the crappy stuff done by somebody else,
Yep.
on the team, and it just makes it an unworkable environment. And
Yep.
so,
Yeah. You just articulated two themes of two chapters of my book.
yeah,
So you're spot on, pretty intuitive. The first one is this idea that perfectionism can cause this tremendous slowing of productivity within teams. It can create an awful bottleneck because, and I in the book, spoiler alert, I liken it to trying to play mini golf, and there's slow golfers in front of you, and you have to wait for them to finish. Everything slows down. You can either wait, you could try to fight them and get them to step aside, or you can just skip the hole. But the bottom line is everything comes to a grinding halt while you're waiting for these people,
right,
to because they're so slow. And you see this in the workplace, and so it absolutely impacts teams. You can imagine how frustrating it can be for managers, leaders, other team members who are trying to do their best and be efficient and get tremendously slowed down by someone like this. It's like being on a one-lane highway with the slow driver who's going 20 miles under the speed limit, and there's no turnoffs, and you're just sort of screaming out the window, right? But I think you can
nobody's
tell
had
what.
that experience.
No, not at all.
Nah.
Everyone listening knows what kind of driver I am. They're like, oh,
Oh
he's
yeah,
that kind of guy, right?
that's the guy.
That's the
That's
kind
the
of
guy
guy
who
he is.
honks.
Yeah. But the other chapter that you described is sort of the chapter 9, which is what do you do when this is other oriented and it starts to project onto other people? This idea of what you should expect from other people. And this word should, I use
Yes.
it purposely because there's should statements, the should this, should that, ought to this, must have. Like there's
Mm.
this really intense universal dictate of what people should or should not be doing for other oriented perfectionists. And it gets particularly toxic when it becomes about morals, moralism. Perfectionists tend to have very strong all or none thinking and expectations about morals and scruples. And so if people are not doing what they think is right or wrong, and then they start to project that out onto other people and then start to communicate with them, it could come across as pretty self-righteous. And that kind of environment can really be toxic for people.
Toxic. Yeah, indeed. In any instance, when that shows up in a workplace, you can imagine for that is a problem, right? That team, that group, that whatever, that is a problem. That individual, it is probably a problem. But how big a problem is it in terms of how often does it happen in the work world? Is there any data, any sort of statistics on, hey, this is a lot bigger problem than anybody thought about it? How come we haven't spoken about this?
It's a big enough problem to where not only has this book resonated with a lot of people who have experienced this in the workplace, but it's a big enough problem where research is showing that it's becoming increasingly problematic in our generations, from generation to generation. Some work by Tom Curran out in the United Kingdom has suggested that perfectionism has been growing over the last 20 to 30 years.
And for reasons he suggests, I mean, does he suggest why?
There are suggestions, I think that it's a self-perpetuating problem in general. People
Mm,
get praised for quality work. It's like when a supermodel gets praised for the way they look, they're going to keep trying to look that way. If a
mhm.
kid is getting A pluses on things and gets all the attention and praise, they're going to try to keep doing that. And so it's this sort of reinforcing model where they're going to keep doing it. And, a lot of the problem is it's really ingrained in society quite a bit. There's this achievement culture
Oh,
that
absolutely.
gets perpetuated. And I'm sure you've seen it in education. I see it in the workplace.
It's, I mean, I
incredible.
remember as a kid sort of experiencing the felt sense that, like, I didn't quite say it this way, but like everything is either a feather in your cap or a kick in the teeth.
Yeah, there's
Right?
no
It's
middle
like,
ground, right?
because nobody and nobody's letting you do anything without telling you where you distribute in the mass of distribution, right? Like, oh, you're in the 93rd percentile. Oh, you're in the 38th percentile. And it's that it almost seems it's in our sports. It's in our, I mean, it shows up everywhere.
Yeah, and the worst thing that I think that we're doing right now is we're not teaching executive functioning skills. Skills like, executive functioning is a suite of skills in your head, like planning and
Sure.
organizing and decision making, like the little, chief executive officers in
Yeah,
your head.
exactly. The assistant that lives in your mind.
Exactly. And we don't teach kids how to use these skills and develop them. And so we have a really difficult time prioritizing. And so kids don't learn the critical thinking and executive functioning skills to prioritize their task effort. And so this is something I write about in chapter 5 of the book, Flawed, is not all tasks are meant to be done equally, right? So I call it the emphasis framework. There's emphasis A, which is to do
Mm,
everything with 110%, full gusto, give it your all. And then there's emphasis B, which is what I call the get her done strategy, just get her done, right? And then there's the emphasis C strategy, which is to not do it at all, just completely ignore it. And there's a time and place for all three of these. There's no
right.
inherent judgment. There is a time and place for emphasis A. Maybe I'm planning my wedding and it's super important to me and I want to make sure I give it my all. Emphasis B, honestly, is what I think should be most things in life. Not everything is written, not things just aren't that important, right? And then emphasis C has plenty of good moments where it shines. Like I never answered the customer service satisfaction call at the end of my, mobile carrier customer service call. I just don't, right? I hang it up because I've determined that it's not worth my time, and that's so important, right? So emphasis A, emphasis B, and emphasis C are strategic. They're used strategically, and they're based on your values. What's important to you, right? And the problem with perfectionism is that perfectionists try to emphasis A everything.
Everything.
And because of that, it's totally impossible. Because of that, things get pushed off and they end up turning into emphasis C. So it's a forced emphasis C, right?
Ah,
Things don't get done, they get pushed off, they're procrastinated. And then ultimately, so what does that mean? That means your perfectionism and your anxiety in that case are choosing your priorities and your behavior, not your values. And so, what I try to do with people in the work setting and in my clinic here, where I treat people with severe perfectionism, is I work with them on this task prioritization based on their values. And essentially, what it ends up meaning is that people are asked to plan or to emphasis B and C things that they think ought to be emphasis A. And it's a real anxiety provoking exercise for them.
hmm.
Right? So instead of spending 3 hours writing this email, you get to write it once, you get to read it one other time, and then you send it off and you have 3 minutes to do this.
Uh,
Or I'd like you to send this email and I'd like you to make a mistake on purpose. And people look at me like I'm like a quack, but I say, look, just create a misspelling in your sign off. Instead of cordially, write quarterly,
right,
right?
right.
And let's see what happens. Let's see if if it's as catastrophic as you think it is. And let's see if you can handle the anxiety, because a lot of people think they can't. And so we do these kinds of exercises and we do it in a systematic way and we do it repeatedly and consensually, right? I would never do this to somebody. And over time, people start to loosen their thinking. They start to get a little bit more flexible. They start to think, oh, this is not as bad as I thought, or I can handle this, or look, the boss didn't even notice, or if they did notice, they didn't even care, right? And so making mistakes on purpose, who would have thought?
How, it's a very naive question, so I apologize, but how bad how bad can it get? I don't mean with a group, but more an individual. No names, and you don't. But if there's an example, like somebody walks in your door, they come for help. They're not. I'm assuming somebody suggested. You really have a problem with that, or it gets to the point where it really becomes unlivable for them.
Yep. And so the book is not tailored to the extreme cases
No, I
because
get that.
oftentimes
I keep asking about the topic, and I know you want to go back to the book and
no, I'm making that
oh,
point for a reason. The reason I'm
okay,
making
good.
that point is because most people with extreme perfectionism, they can't even survive in a job in the first
Yeah,
place. So
yeah,
the
yeah.
book is meant for people that are not that extreme, because those extreme folks, you're not going to really see them a bunch in the workplace.
Mm,
And so you asked me this question, and the answer is they can get really clinically severe, to the point where people can't hold jobs, they can't get through school, they can't maintain relationships. They just become essentially paralyzed. They can't make decisions. They
wow.
get stuck. They get stuck doing things for hours per day. They feel like they're just, the worst people in the world, that because they're either perfect or they're not. And so if they're not, that means they're awful people. And so you get like tremendous depression and helplessness and anxiety and
Mm,
suicidality, and like it can get extremely severe. And so I see them in my clinic, and this partly is what inspired me to write the book. Is like there's an approach to dealing with this, and it can help them. And if it can help them, it can also help the masses of people out in the
mhm.
workforce that struggle with this on a lesser level, but still struggling. And most importantly, it can help managers and leaders work with those people.
Do you
And
ever get managers and leaders who are themselves perfectionists? And usually that would make them not particularly successful managers or leaders, right? Because they're putting on their teams, they're putting on the people that report to them, conditions and requirements that nobody really wants to live under. So,
yeah, so it depends, right? Some people make it quite high and are quite successful with perfectionism because it can have really good qualities that come with it. Things like conscientiousness and loyalty and honesty and attention to detail. There's a lot of good qualities that come with it. And also, there are certain types of jobs where perfectionism really can help you thrive to a certain degree. Right? If
yes,
you're a computer programmer, for example, or a surgeon, it could probably be pretty helpful. But there
totally.
does get to a point where I think there's a point of diminishing returns. And yes, lots of leaders have perfectionism, but you tend to find the best and most successful leaders tend not to have perfectionism. So you tend to see CEOs that are super successful, they tend not to be super perfectionistic, because you have to be able to be quick and nimble, and you have to make decisions on the fly. You have to be willing to take risk. You can't sit there and be indecisive.
Right, right.
And you have to be willing to be accountable for mistakes. And so you tend to get the CEOs of a lot of companies, especially successful ones, tend not to be super perfectionistic. The people right below them, they are the ones that could be.
Yeah.
So
Well,
you have
also
your
the CEOs, at least the best ones that I've ever met, that they have a knack for seeing seeing in people what the best that person can be, and
Mhm.
steer them in a way, and celebrate and encourage those things, which probably that person brings more of than anybody else in the place. And so if you can shape a set of expectations that really draws on that person's strengths, and those CEOs, they're good at that. The good ones are really good at that.
Yeah, they could take a perfectionist, and assuming that they're not doing things to try to reduce the negative impact.
Yeah.
That would be this partly what my book is about, is like, how do you reduce the negative impact? But they probably do find just the right niche for them to
Mhm.
succeed and to gain most value from their perfectionistic tendencies.
Yeah.
The book is not about changing someone from to do a 180 from being a perfectionist to someone who's sloppy and terrible. It's about how do you mitigate the damage that can come from perfectionism, and then preserve some of the good qualities that come
And
with it as well.
and I know they're in there. I mean, I've read through them, some of them, but are there are those tasks easy to do? Right. I mean, are there simple things that people can get a handle on either themselves because they suffer from it.
Mhm.
Suffer may be the wrong word, but they recognize they're less in control than the perfectionism, or a manager can actually make suggestions that are useful for that
Yeah.
perfectionist.
Yeah, there are and there are certain suggestions in the book that I would go back to. And one of them I just was discussing, I think, is a useful framework, the emphasis framework for communicating the importance of task prioritization and what's truly important based on your values. How's that important to the company and the company's values, or the school and the school's values,
Yeah,
or the,
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
marriage and the marriage values? There's you can apply this anywhere. And the idea is, can you create a shared language and worldview around this idea that we really encourage quality work, but we also equally appreciate efficiency. And we are a safe place where if you make mistakes, like, and it was in the spirit of innovation and efficiency, you know, go
Yeah,
get them, right?
go,
Like,
go,
that's good,
go. Rock
right?
and
And
roll.
I was just thinking about a baseball analogy. I don't know if you're a baseball guy, but
I was.
you were, right? So the idea is, like, if someone is if you're giving your baseball player a base, let's say a stolen base threat base runner, some leeway to steal third, especially if if it would make the first or the third out, which is a no-no in baseball, right? You never try to get out at third base because you can score easily from second on a base hit.
Right.
But, like, sometimes that base runner is going to get out at third base trying to steal. They're
Yeah,
going to misjudge. And the idea is, how do you approach that? Do you scold them and tell them, like, that's a no-no? You violated this, sacred rule of baseball. Because by doing that, you're creating a psychologically unsafe environment where the person's not going to be willing to take risks anymore.
mm,
And if that's what you're trying to encourage,
right.
great, go for it. But if you're encouraging someone to take risks, be innovative, run on their gut, like these kinds of things, you can't have it both ways. And so you have to be careful what environment you set up. And you want a psychologically safe one where someone feels like they can take that risk.
Well, and also, I mean, in some ways, it circles back to that first question, where's the line, right? Because you want somebody, in the perfect world, you want somebody to be, you'll excuse the expression, perfectly discerning, right? This is it, I can make it to third, and they're
Right.
right, as opposed to, oh, no, too much of a risk. Sorry, so I'm staying on
Yep.
second. And if they could discern perfectly, they wouldn't be perfectionists. They
Yeah.
could easily see that line, right, and
Right.
make the right decisions and then not punish themselves. And that's the kind of, I think that's the kind of environment, is you imagine what's a healthy work environment. It's an environment where this person wants me to be me, but a more discerning version of it.
Right.
Right? I can make better decisions around this thing that he or she agrees with. Yeah,
Or
taking
maybe
third.
it's time to have a feedback session and be like, look, this is not your strong suit, right?
Yeah,
Like, Frank Thomas shouldn't be stealing third base. I don't know. He's a big third baseman. Like, you don't need, or first baseman, you don't need to be stealing third base. Like, maybe this is a job for somebody else, right?
right, right.
And the idea is, I think discerning who needs to have the ability to, or who has the ability to discern, or can they even reach that
Yeah,
level. And that's kind of nuanced thinking, is not something that a perfectionist tends to do very well. They're very
right.
all or none. They're very yes or no, black or white. And they tend to be very rule driven. And I talk about this in chapter 7, is that they tend to be overly focused on rules, and sometimes at the expense of the underlying principle. Right. And so, for example, I use the example of a sign near a pool. It's summertime, so let's think about pools for a second. And the pool says no running, right? It's a very important rule. I think we can all agree, unless you're a kid who doesn't want to not run at a
Right.
pool. But for the most part, adults can see the logic in not running near a pool. Well, that rule is based on a principle. That principle is that pools are dangerous because the ground gets wet and it's slippery and you can fall and crack your head open. The value underlying that principle is safety, public
Sure.
safety. And so you have this sort of pyramid scheme where you have this rule built on a principle, built on a value. And the problem with perfectionists is that they tend to overemphasize the rule at the
The
top.
rule.
sometimes at the expense of the underlying principle driving that rule. And the example I give is if the lifeguard is whistling and yelling at a parent for running near the pool because they're trying to save a child drowning in the pool, right? There's an example of someone being super rigid about a rule and in a way that completely contradicts the underlying
Absolutely.
principle.
Good example. Good example.
Mhm.
As you were speaking, is like, is there, in your travels, would you say there's any sort of overlap between uh, perfectionism, which feels like a sort of an obsession? We spoke about that a moment ago, or a little while ago, but people on the spectrum. So often, people on the spectrum um, are intensely focused on rules.
Yes. So people with autism on the autism spectrum have higher rates of perfectionism than
They have
people
higher
without autism.
rates of perfectionism.
Yes. And they also tend to be much more rule bound and concrete in their thinking. And they tend to be very all or none in their thinking and very rigid in their thinking. So yes, we see a lot of perfectionism among people on the spectrum.
But
It's not surprising because we
there's no,
see perfectionism in general is not associated with a specific disorder. It's not a diagnosis, but
yeah,
it's a personality component, a personality feature, and it correlates very strongly with the obsessive compulsive disorder spectrum, and it correlates very strongly with the autism spectrum. And not surprisingly, the autism spectrum and the OCD spectrum, the obsessive compulsive spectrum, they are very highly
very highly
correlated
correlated. Yeah,
both genetically and based on their presentation.
yeah,
So the idea that perfectionism shows up in both is not a surprise. But it's not necessary. You don't see perfectionism in everyone with autism, and you don't see
sure,
perfectionism in everyone with OCD either.
right. I see.
And you don't see, and people with perfectionism don't always have either of those. Like you can have just perfectionistic tendencies.
Right, right. Um, so a personal question. So, do you have any insight into how you landed in this territory of of was it gonna? I was gonna be humorous, but I don't know you well enough. But I was gonna say with this obsession for perfectionism. I mean, like,
Yeah.
why is this territory something that was a point of fascination or interest? Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, my compulsive need to be an expert in OCD. Yeah, no, it's I became fascinated with OCD in grad school. I also was training to work in the autism spectrum, and so I saw the overlap. I actually ended up switching more towards OCD because I just fell in love with it. And part of it is that OCD was fascinating to me, but also the treatments for it are just amazingly effective in general. And so it was really rewarding to provide a
Ah,
treatment that just absolutely was the gold standard for psychotherapy and cognitive behavior therapy.
mhm.
And but as a presentation, it was just really fascinating. In terms of my own experience, I don't have OCD, but I would say that I've experienced my own levels of perfectionism. And so I think part of my interest in OCD also resonated with me because of that, and seeing some similarities in the OCD world and the perfectionism world. Now,
Mm,
my perfectionism wasn't nearly as extreme as some of the cases I talk about in like from my clinic, but I think it gives me a little bit more of a personal understanding of what this perfectionism thing is all about.
mhm. Yeah, it is. Especially when you see it. I mean, I remember. I was thinking about this podcast today, and I remember uh, one place I lived. I belonged to a gym, and I would show up, as did, all creatures of habit. We would all show up, mostly the same people at the same early time. We wanted to get our workout in early and whatever. And so I didn't necessarily know the people, but we knew each other. We all sort of knew each other, but not really. And
Mhm.
this one guy, watched him one day, and it's like I'd seen him every day. And he went around. He was dressed in his gym clothes, brought his work clothes with him into the gym because he was obviously going off to work after that, and closed the car door, and then went around and checked every car door that it was locked. He clicked it
Mhm.
and it locked, but he went around, and he must have gone around 4 or 5 times every door, checking it 4 or 5 times, and pressing the each time, maybe 3 or 4 times. So it was almost like a ritual, right? But it wasn't clearly not. And then I realized he did it all the time. He did it every day. Every day he showed up and that was his thing. And it was just, in some ways it seemed benign, but you just don't know
Yeah.
where else and how else that surfaces.
Well, yeah, and we call that a ritual in OCD. It is an OCD ritual.
Hmm.
So I don't know if that's OCD because I wasn't there. I don't know what the purpose of the behavior was, but I would not be shocked by any stretch of the
No,
imagination if that were an OCD presentation. And the other thing I would say is if you're seeing that in the parking lot of the gym, most likely that's not the only time and place where that individual is struggling with that kind of a ritual.
right.
So it's
Well,
unclear.
and I wonder, I mean, it's an easy assumption. It's like that's a struggle. But is it a struggle? Or
Oh,
is it
yeah.
just, or is it just, no, that's what I do. I want to make sure the
Well, I
doors are
mean,
locked.
that's a great
Whatever.
question, and that's what separates people with OCD from people without it is how much does it get in the way of your
Does it
life?
get in the way of your life?
How much
Yeah.
does it cause you distress? How much does it
Yeah.
affect the people around you?
Yeah.
And if you check off any of those boxes, it's probably OCD.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I have another question, maybe perhaps a final question, because I'm trying to be sensitive to your time.
Mhm.
Um, if I knew what I was talking about, what would I have asked you that you wish you could have answered? You wish you could have said that, but I didn't. We didn't get there.
I think the only thing that I didn't get a chance to answer that you had asked was like, what do you do if the boss has perfectionistic
Oh yeah,
tendencies, right? And
yeah. Hard to imagine, right? But
luckily, there's a fantastic book out there for that. It's called Flawed: Why Perfectionism is a Challenge for Management, by Dr. Greg Chasson. Specifically, chapter 10 is where I flip the script. So the rest of the
you
book is about
do.
how,
I didn't
yes,
get there. I'm so sorry.
that's all right. Chapter 1 through 9 is all about how do you deal with perfectionism in your teams.
Yeah.
Chapter 10 flips it for people that want to know how do you deal with a perfectionistic boss. And there are ways in there that I talk about how you might be able to recognize it. It shows how it sort of manifests a little differently. Like perfectionistic bosses can come across as a little bit stingy. They tend to ask for what's called a role reversal reassurance seeking question, like how, like, am I a good boss? Was that a
Right.
reasonable decision? Like questions that would suggest that they're seeking reassurance about whether they did a good job as a boss. And then there's some other things in there as well. But the idea in safety behaviors and rituals and avoidances, and then I give some strategies on how to set boundaries, assertiveness training, and then ultimately send the message along that sometimes you only have so much control in a work
Right.
environment, that if your boss
Right.
has perfectionism and is unwilling to respond to any of your
You gotta get.
gentle
Yeah.
nudges, your only leverage is
You gotta go up the ladder
you got to
somewhere.
go up the
Yeah.
ladder or find a
Or
different
get
job.
out. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. There's always that.
There's always that.
Yes. Well, Greg Chasson, I'm glad you're doing the job you're doing.
Well, thank
It
you.
sounds both fascinating and yeah, I imagine it would that book would resonate with lots of people because I see it. I saw it. I worked pe- for a little bit of time. I worked in Snapchat, um,
Mhm.
and not as a coder, but I worked with many coders
Oh
really,
yeah. Uh-huh.
and watching how that showed up. Well, I'm clearly not a clinician and couldn't make it, but watching the frustration that came from sort of both versions of that. Sometimes it was the guy in charge, and sometimes it was the guy who was working on the team, and you know, and it was clearly there, and it's like, wow, this and sometimes really got out of hand, which was
Oh yeah.
kind of why I was there, not as a psychologist, but as a person who facilitated conversation between people who tend not to share how they feel about things. So,
Like computer scientists and programmers. Yeah, exactly. They tend to be a little bit more of
yes,
the
indeed. Oh, yeah.
internal bunch that don't like to
Uh,
speak. I've always thought perfectionism would be a great topic to come and discuss with corporations in Silicon Valley because there's probably like perfectionists coming out of their ears.
I don't think, I don't think, I don't think the technological world we now swim in, it would be 50 years behind if it wasn't for perfectionists in Silicon Valley. It's like,
Right.
the whole place is filled with it.
Right, but I wonder how much how much farther we could be if there wasn't all the
If there
distress
wasn't, yes,
right?
that's true.
If they just used their talents instead and were
Yeah.
flexible around it instead of,
Yeah. It's
yeah,
funny.
it's really
It's funny.
interesting.
This is a story apropos of nothing. I'm sure I'll cut it out, but I was in grad school. No, I was in undergraduate school, but I was toward the end of my time, and I was, like I'd finished all my course requirements, blah blah blah, and so I really liked math, and but I had never taken a math theory class. I didn't even really understand what the hell that was. So I took one, and it was fascinating, wonderful. We met at night, and one day this guy, the professor, whose name I won't remember, walked in with a friend of his, whose name I won't remember, who was the Nobel Prize winner.
Uh-huh.
And he just was talking to us, not about something in particular, I don't think, but just talking to us. And it was back in the day where you could smoke in rooms.
Right.
And he's sitting there, and he's sitting up at the front of the room. He's just sitting down, and he's got a steaming hot cup of coffee and a cigarette, and he's talking, and he's drinking his coffee and taking these big, and at a moment he kind of caught himself, and he looked up, he looked at his fingers. If not for coffee and cigarettes, math would be 50 years behind where it is today. It's like, okay.
That's probably true for most industries.
I think that's probably right. That's probably right. Well, Greg Chasson, Dr. Greg Chasson, Gregory Chasson, the Dr. Gregory Chasson, or Greg.
Greg is fine. Yes.
Thank you so much for being willing to come and talk about this book that is obviously caught on. I hope you're making lots of money selling it and doing workshops everywhere. And yeah, it's clearly both interesting and important, and people really suffer from it. So
thank you for this. And it sounds like I have a convert on my hands. At first you're like, is this really something you see in business? And now you're like, oh, this is.
Yeah. And it really started me thinking about some of the students that I've dealt with over the years, and that inability. And again, as I said at the beginning, sometimes they were phenomenal students. The work they produced was crazy good. And sometimes we didn't even know if they were phenomenal students because they couldn't start. They couldn't start. And then other times they couldn't finish. And so.
Yeah, they get stuck. And they get stuck. And I'm hoping that my book will help them get unstuck.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And certainly your work is doing that. And so I hope that book, and the book again is
Flawed.
Got paper. Flawed. Why perfectionism is a challenge for management, and why perfectionism is a challenge. It says for management, but if somebody's, I would imagine, at least the parts that I've read, that it would offer insights to. Don't just think of it as a business book. It will offer insights to people that work in groups.
Yeah, don't tell anyone. That's the secret of this book, is that it's actually not just for management. I've had people read it who are not even in business, and they found it to be perfectly applicable to what they're going through. In teams, in schools, in marriages, and you name it, religious organizations. I picked an audience to write this to, and I think it works very well for managers and leaders. But if you're a perfectionist, I think you'll benefit. If you're living with a perfectionist, I think you'll benefit. If your parents are a perfectionist, I think you'll benefit. If your podcaster is a perfectionist, I think you'll benefit. Like, I think that there's a transcendent nature to it.
Totally. That part I got, indeed. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much. Really a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for having me.
And good luck with whatever's next.
Thank you.
You're listening to Curiosity Invited with David Bryan here on LA Talk Radio.